Dr. Martin Bergman was the inaugural recipient, along with his wife Maria, of NPAP's Oscar Sternbach Award. He is a master teacher of psychoanalysis to many generations. Dr. Bergman's first analytic teaching was sponsored by Theodor Reik. He is the author and editor of many volumes, including The Anatomy of Loving, In the Shadow of Moloch, The Evolution of Psychoanalytic Technique, Understanding Dissidence and Controversy, and he is currently a clinical professor of psychology at NYU postdoc. And he is 97 years young. Dr. Bergman.
In the morning, there was much talk about analysts fading, and many of those who faded were good friends of mine. So I figured out that I found a way of non-fading. So I'm still here. Okay, now, to begin the serious part of my talk, when I think about Theodor Reik, and I had known him because I was a member of his seminar, one item remains in my memory for my gratitude towards him, and that is the term, the surprise psychoanalyst. That you don't find in Freud. We never find Freud at all saying, this surprised me very much. Now, when Reich introduced that concept, he did something which I did something more with it. I used that to differentiate between interpretation and construction. And interpretation takes place when the patient is saying something and you understand what he is saying, it goes through you and you know that you realize it, and then you say to the patient. So that the interpretation is something which the patient has evoked in you and comes to you as a source of surprise. By comparison with interpretation, construction is a different story. Construction is something which you learned in school and which you are ready to understand about the patient, not because something happened between two of you, but because you have learned it and you are ready to interpret it. Now, in an interpretation, you never have to worry about the timing. You feel it and you say it and it's appropriate. When it comes to construction, it's a very different story because you understand it and you know it, but you have to worry. If I mention it now, I will say the most important thing at a time when the patient cannot hear it. If I wait too long, as many analysts did over a long period of time, I am wasting the patient's time. It's hard for me to hold back, and altogether it's a very unhappy experience. So the reconstruction is a problem, the interpretation is an expression of the relationship. And for this item of interpretation as a surprise, I am grateful to Reich, and now that I expressed my gratitude, I can tell you some other things, which I will. Now, my job has been here to speak about confession, because the book that I am to discuss is Reich's book written in 1949, Fragments of a Great Confession. Now, the question in my mind is, what is confession? And later on, is there a psychoanalytic interpretation of confession? And I do think that there is. Psychoanalysis has a lot to say about the meaning of confession, because confession is powerful only at a certain stage of development. You already have to have guilt feelings to wish to confess. You already have to know that this was wrong in order to confess. But you are not as yet fully developed because you think that if you say that to somebody, you will feel better. Now, if you have a superego which is intact and harsh, a confession will not do you much good because the person to whom you are confessing may forgive you, but your superego will not. So confession operates in the area where there is some guilt, there is superego, but it's not sufficiently internalized. Psychoanalysis has another problem with confession, and that is you usually can confess only crimes that you have committed. But the psychoanalytic court is very different. What is than any other court anywhere in the world? Because the punishment is conscious and the crime is not. So that this is based on a particular relationship between ego and superego. And I have to spend a moment to explain it. When repression takes place, the ego doesn't know anymore what has been repressed. So in that sense, the ego is unaware of the repression. However, the superego is not concerned with that because the superego has its own spies into the id. So the superego is capable of punishing you for the crimes that your ego knows nothing about. So that is the complication, and what we need to understand is that confession is limited in its use to something which you think you have done which is wrong. Actually, there are two ways in which confession can be used. One is in religious terms, I confess my sins, and the other one is in civic terms, I confess my misdeed. But if I don't know what my misdeeds are, I also cannot confess. So we have a special attitude towards the confession as something which takes place after a certain amount of guilt has been developed, but the guilt feelings are not yet internalized. Now, the book that I'm going to discuss is Theodor Reik's Fragments of a Great Confession, and now I have to talk about Reik's attitude towards confession, but I will delay it for another minute. Because when I met Reik, it was after I was discharged from the army, there were two places where non-medical analysts could learn psychoanalysis. One was to go be in a seminar with Paul Phaedon, and the other one is to go into a seminar with Theodor Reik. Well, figuring that two is better than one, I attended both. However, at the time when I went to Reik, he was in his anti-Freudian phase. I know this phase is no longer remembered and we might just as well forget it, but when I was in his seminar, he used to talk a lot about his differences with Freud, and what remained in my memory is that Freud's libido theory was an unbelievably colossal mistake. So that he both paid homage to it, but also regarded it as a mistake. And when I had to choose between him and my other teacher, I remained in the Paul Phaedon camp. However, that did not prevent Theodor Reik from asking me to start teaching the dream interpretation course at the NPAP, and thus he started me on a teaching career, and I'm thankful to him for that, because now I teach every day. So there was something that started then, that he started, that was very useful and very important in my life, for which I am very grateful to him. Now, what is Fragments of a Great Confession? Fragments of a Great Confession consist of 3 different parts. The first part is a book that Reik wrote in German in 1929, Why Goethe Left Frederica. I doubt that today in America anybody will be excited one way or another why Goethe left Frederica. But in Germany and in the German cultural point, this was of interest, and it contains the middle section of the whole book. Now, what is in that book is that Goethe, at the time, with another friend of his, went to visit 2 daughters of a Protestant pastor. And Goethe disguised himself as a poor student of theology. And under this disguise, he managed to evoke the love of Frederica. What was so specific was a story that Goethe carried with him, which is very well known to anybody who knows something psychoanalytic about Goethe. Goethe had a fear of kissing. And the way he arrived to this fear was there were 2 sisters who were in love with him, and the one who lost kissed him vehemently, very long, and after she finished, she said, anybody who kisses Goethe after me will be cursed. Now, for some reason, Goethe took it very seriously and confessed all of that to Frederica. Now, what did Frederica do? It's not so hard to guess. In spite of the curse, she kissed him. And it seemed like the curse has lifted. But what does fate do? After a while, Frederica becomes sick. And now Goethe develops the idea that it was the fact that she kissed him that is responsible for her illness, and then he shuns her. There's another story in that book which is of some interest, because there is a story called the Neue Melisande, the New Melisande. And the story is the following. A young man meets a woman who is beautiful and is sitting in a carriage, and he is attracted to her, but she says to him, if you want me, you have to take care of my box. And she hands him a box which he has to take care of. Now, from time to time, that woman disappears. And the man who in the story doesn't know where she has disappeared. And then it turns out that for a certain part of every month, she shrinks to a very tiny size, and then she lives in this box. He has to take care of her during the time when he is in the box, and then she returns to him, and she not only gives him all her love she can, but she also gives him enough money so that he can gamble as much as he wants to. So this is the arrangement between the two, and Reik offers the interpretation to that the idea that one is a gnome and that they are in the world of the giants is very understandable. Because when we are little, everybody looks gigantic. So this is the attitude of the small child to the big world. to be a giant among the Lilliputian is the opposite. It's a reaction formation against this childhood wish. So now Reik interpreted this book, and it was published, as I said, in German in 1929. Now what happened in 1949? Somebody at Reik's instigation translated the book into English, and what I told you is the middle of that book. But before we come to that, there is a rather large section in which Reik describes, or if you wish, confesses his relationship to Goethe. And it was mentioned already in the morning here that what he confesses is that he was under the compulsion to read every word that Goethe has written, but not in the ordinary Goethe one-volume tradition, but in the standard 55-volume edition of the learned final work of Goethe. Now this he had to read, and he had to read it even as he, like Faust, which he already knew by heart. Well, I don't think that Reik does anything particularly significant in explaining this compulsion, but what he believes, and I'm not sure he is right, that we gain a great deal about understanding Goethe if we understand Reik's worship of him and wishing for him to know everything by heart. But at the end of the book, Reik goes through a third phase of separating himself from Goethe, which is not that hard. Goethe had a different life than Reik, and Goethe captured every woman he wanted to. Reik had great difficulty, not only for outside circumstances, but also for inside. He had to reject the woman first, and when the woman then turned to him, he always was ambivalent. And much of the third part is devoted to a tragic history between Reik and his first wife. She became ill, and he used to visit her in the hospital. Once, when he visited the wife in the hospital, he met a nurse in the corridor. Meeting this nurse, they started an affair. So while he was visiting his wife, he was also having an affair with the nurse. Eventually, the wife learned about it and got very unhappy, left Reik, went to visit their son in, at that time, Palestine, returned to her parents in Vienna, and died in Vienna, separated from Reik, and Reik was left with a great deal of guilt feelings. Now, Reik believes that he started a new kind of biography, namely where you tell the biographer's own unconscious and then you tell the story. Whether or not this confession really contributes very much, I don't know. But I wanted to contrast sharply the statement of the confession of Wilhelm Reich with the statement of Freud, because the two are very different. But this I have to read. Yeah. First, I have a quote from Reich. When I read Goethe's tale of the Sesenheim idyll, I decided that I would act differently if I were in love with a girl. I did not understand that his conduct was the only possible for him and that other factors determine my own development. So in the third part, he is differentiating himself. Goethe comes, sees, and conquers. That's the famous Latin, veni vidi victis. And the woman he falls in love with is none of them can resist the overpowering magnetism of his magnificent personality, but he does not approach them sexually because he is afraid that his kisses will damage them. Now I want to contrast this statement of Reich with two statements by Freud. The first one was written to his fiancée in 1885, even before Freud made any of his great discovery. And he writes to her, one intention, as a matter of fact, I have almost finishing carrying out, an intention which a number of as yet unborn and unfortunate people will one day resent. Since you won't guess what kind of people I am referring to, I will tell you at once. They are my biographers. I have destroyed all my notes of the past 14 years, as well as letters, scientific excerpts, and the manuscript of my papers. As for the biographer, let them worry. We have no desire to make it too easy for them. Each one of them will be right in his opinion, the development of the hero. And I am already looking forward to seeing them go astray. Now that was written in 1895 before Freud had discovered the Oedipus complex. Now he repeats the same statement in the letter to Arnold Zweig in 1936. Anyone turning biography commits himself to lies, to concealment, to hypocrisy, to flattery, and even hiding his own lack of understanding. For biographical truth is not to be had, and even if it were, it couldn't be used. Truth is unobtainable. Humanity does not deserve it, and incidentally, wasn't our Prince Hamlet right when he asked whether anyone would escape whipping if he got what he deserves? So I'm going to end my talk by telling you that you have two choices. The choice of Wilhelm Reich, of, in my opinion, over-confessing, and the choice of Sigmund Freud, who made it extremely difficult for us to know his biography, and we actually know a great deal about him only because Princess Marie Bonaparte bought the fleece letters and refused to destroy them, even though Freud asked for it. So because she had the courage to refuse, her analyst, we know something about Freud. If Freud had his way, we would be all allowed to guess and not know. I think the contrast between the two is very interesting. Thank you for listening.
As Dany Nobus had said in a paper, there's a confusion between Wilhelm Reich, Theodor Reik, and Reiki. Reiki. Thank you.
Very brief. Nothing to say.
Dr. Anna Aragno did not so much receive her analytic training as she sought it out. She created her own multidisciplinary program of study in order to acquire the breadth of knowledge recommended by Freud as well as Reich for all future analysts. Her broad interdisciplinary background has resulted in two major works so far. The first in 1997, Symbolization, proposing a developmental paradigm for a new psychoanalytic theory of mind. And the second, in 2008, Forms of Knowledge, a psychoanalytic study of human communication. She is in practice here in New York and is a former prima ballerina. Dr. Aragno.
Thank you. Thank you. I haven't reached the heights of 97, so I do not have the clarity of mind to speak extemporaneously. I'm going to have... Yeah, but that's the problem. I want to know, can you hear me?
To speak a bit closer to the microphone.
Me closer to... How is this? Except that I won't be able to see at the same time. Okay. No, never mind. I will try to do... Does this work? What does it need?
Wait, he's going to...
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I'm really sorry. Is this okay?
He's going to raise the level.
Okay. Of the volume. Oh, thank you. Is it better now? Okay. My paper is... my assignment today is on listening with the third ear. And the title of my paper is Listening with a Third Ear, a Second Heart, and a Sixth Sense, Standing on the Shoulders of Theodor Reik. It's a little long, and some of the background material, which is my passion, has already been covered. But so you will hear it again, but I will rush through this. Okay, so the paper is in 3 sections. The formative years, beginnings, will be cut short. And then there's the book and the little coda. So I am deeply honored to have been invited to commemorate one of the great figures in our history, all the more since I felt most undeserving. Like many not trained at NPAP, I knew of Reik, but not nearly enough about him or his writings. It has been a privilege to delve into the man and his classic, Listening with the Third Ear. Coinciding with the formal founding of NPAP, 1948 must have been a formidable year for a man who had certainly had his share of adversity. The book appears at the apex of a life and career characterized by controversy, displacements, and reconstitution again and again. Yet, despite many tribulations, Reik acquired what few analysts achieve anywhere, anytime: a popular readership and a name. Listening with the Third Ear combines a private compulsion to reveal with a public passion for his profession, melding these two formidable drives into an exhaustive exposition of the psychoanalyst's instrument. We are presented, I believe, with a singular masterpiece, of its time, no doubt, gilded with the rhetoric and verbosity of another era, weighted by detailed anecdote and meandering association, without adequate vocabulary, and this is still true today, to define all that he knows about listening with an ear that he emphasizes is not given to all, yet a masterpiece nonetheless. Organized into 4 parts, the book builds in a crescendo towards the final section, the language of the soul, holding us in its grip, carrying us enthusiastically, convincingly, and finally triumphantly through 513 pages of dense description, covering virtually everything about psychoanalytic listening. From the first chapters, one understands that the man and his listening are one. This fundamental truism that analysts must have a deep and thorough knowledge of themselves as instruments of their profession runs through the whole book. Reading on, we get to know how far more than hearing is involved in this kind of listening. And soon we find we have warmed to this deeply human, sardonic, sharply opinionated, and consummately skilled analytic thinker. Undoubtedly, these engaging traits, for better or for worse, were there at the outset, earning him the paternal support received from Freud, as well as the clashes he apparently partly incited due to his uncompromising convictions. Formative years, beginnings. Of the early acolytes clustering around Freud, Reik was certainly a favored son for his talent, but also for his circumstance. Born in 1888 into a middle-class secular household of Jewish extraction with 2 preferred older brothers and a younger sister, and orphaned by 22, Reik was permanently scarred by premature loss and a burden of guilt surrounding his father's death. Yet only a year later, he had already introduced himself to Freud via his dissertation on Flaubert. Early contributions flowed fast and furious, so that in 1918, Freud chose him to be the first recipient of the new award for applied psychoanalysis, and he continued this stream of productivity for the rest of his life. After the notorious legal debacle that spurred Freud's famous On Lay analysis, Reik was obliged to leave Vienna, initiating a pattern of expulsion, exile, and resurgence that would become his life motif. History, no less than character, determines our fate. After detours to Berlin, Amsterdam, and London, Reik finally landed in New York, a seasoned, well-established analyst of the first elite circle. That he would encounter expulsion from the very heart of psychoanalysis in America is yet another twist of fate, met again with fortitude and resurgence. Reik's formative years were anchored in the customs, culture, and style of the city of his birth. The Vienna into which Reik was born was a maelstrom of contradictory, progressive and regressive, repressive and explosive tensions at the threshold of a century of turbulent upheaval, with the ever-present Jewish problem hovering in the shadows. Of central importance would have been the value placed on culture. Music, literature, theater, and the classics were staples, mixing in the Viennese air with etiquette and illicit affairs, waltzes, operettas, strudel, and Schlagzeugen. Artistic temperaments like Reik's would have soaked up current trends from the air. I have to skip this, although it's all about him probably being very familiar with the current cultural milieu and also scientific milieu at the same time. So these were also these were also times of duplicative lives, when public facade hid a shadow side of human nature split between outer decorum and inner demon. The strength of propriety thread through the weaves of society had thinned and was tearing under the pressure of suppressed self-expression. Barely recovering from Darwin, Freud was already unveiling an aboriginal population in the mind, inhabiting a seething cauldron of obscure forces, kept at bay by a defensive barrier, as the unconscious burst on the scene. With repression at the etiological center and uncovering the principal goal, concerned with truth, moral and psychological courage in confronting dark sides of oneself in ways heretofore unthinkable, gave new depth to human motives and behaviors. The idea that symptoms had meaning captured fresh minds. More importantly, Freud's psychoanalytic framework provided a new paradigm for interpreting art, humor, beliefs, and human evolution, as well as the individual psyche. Reik's combination of psychological studies and literary tendencies served him well as he began applying psychoanalytic ideas to a variety of topics. But it was with Freud's general theory of mind, his first topographical model, and its rich early yields that young intellectuals were intrigued. They participated in furthering a strain of psychoanalysis as a broad, new, multidisciplinary framework, far wider in interpretive scope than that of its clinical application. And so began a schism in psychoanalysis between medical and non-medical mentalities, issuing from deeply divergent backgrounds, interests, and philosophical roots. The former concerned with etiology and causal explanation, the latter with universal unconscious dynamics through which to reinterpret the psychical traits and evolution of humankind. Today, this schism is a virtual chasm between psychoanalytic therapy versus psychoanalysis, a general theory of mind. The singular innovation of this threefold methodology was its establishment of a semantic of the unconscious, an interpretive sphere with several referential perspectives from which to identify and signify unconscious processes expressed through behavioral, imagistic, and linguistic signals, signs, and symbols. Unconscious meanings call for a specialized attentional stance for their detection, one that reopens channels of communication attuned to primary process and modes of interaction that are commonly overlaid by language. So the issue of technique, the instrumentality of how one listens as conditioning what one will hear, is quite central to Reik's argument with the community. Like Freud, he believed that psychoanalysis was not a branch of medicine and prefaced many works reiterating that its greatest value may not be clinical, but its methodological applicability as a universal depth psychology. Despite his later atheoretical turn, Reik's loyalty to Freud extended far beyond reverence for his ideas to modeling himself on the founder, and he was eager to make singular contributions. His concept of surprise was an original idea, and he coined two iconic psychoanalytic aphorisms, the third year, taken from Nietzsche, and victory in defeat, perfectly encapsulating the power forces underlying the pleasure and pain dynamics of masochism. Reik's confessional style originated in Goethe's belief that the writer must bare his soul, and in Freud's autoanalysis. But overriding impulses lay in natural endowment and the historical moment. Ancestry is reflected in personal style, with its flamboyant admixture of humility and hubris, wit and exegesis, belligerence and brilliance. His creativity was not only what propelled him to fame, but the means by which he reclaimed himself, always moving from negative circumstance to positive accomplishment. And finally, his intellectual bent, to lay down a theme, as in a musical composition, in short early papers, and then recapitulate core ideas, expanding them into substantial works, enables us to observe the continuity and maturational curve of his professional evolution. And now the book, How to Listen to the Unconscious. Reik's early papers reveal that he was already at the center of a controversy regarding how and where to place the scientific framework of psychoanalysis. These contain seeds of ideas, traits, and tendencies that fully flower in Listening with the Third Ear, 1948. A born secessionist, aware of his personal need to defect from an enemy group, he would insist on psychoanalysis as a general psychology based on the empiricism of a method contingent on a non-dogmatic listening stance, stressing the importance of not pigeonholing a technique that was to remain loose and free, reliant on the interpretive sensibilities of each analyst. By empirical, Reik meant data emerging from and pertaining to the psychoanalytic situation. After 37 years of practice, Reik is ripe and ready to go to unparalleled lengths to exhibit the inner processes and experience of the listening analyst. To understand the majestic sweep of such an enterprise, one has to understand where Reik was coming from. In its earliest stages, psychoanalysis was challenging and potentially shattering philosophical speculations on the nature of human knowledge. Not only was it dislodging our homocentric view of ourselves in the grand scheme of things, but paralleling the quantum revolution in physics, it was revolutionizing the underpinnings of epistemology itself, upon which rest the methodological foundations of any scientific investigation. Through empirical observation, psychoanalysis joined developmental and experimental psychology in slowly redrawing the boundaries of human knowledge. Inadvertently, psychoanalysis was participating in a much broader paradigm shift yet to come, which would turn us away from what we know to an exploration of how we know it. Reik's early papers pre-echo his overriding commitment later on to preserving the psychoanalysis of his time. This is the psychoanalysis of the dream and joke books, of 3 essays, of unconscious slips and strangled affects, the goal of which was to uncover the deeper meanings of the dynamically repressed. It is the psychoanalysis of the first applications to literature, art, phylogenesis, of Freud's papers on technique, to which Reik remained fervently loyal. The breakthrough psychoanalysis of a talking method through which to lift repression, the etiological theory on which it is based. The psychoanalysis of a mental topography, a mind of many layers, each unknown to the other, of the first great wave of works that illumined the origins, effects, and consequences of repression. Reik expresses his commitment in his opposition to any formulaic technical or theoretical prescriptions, believing that the sine qua non of the analytic attitude is approaching psychical material with total openness of mind. He considered the unconscious an independent sense organ, trained in analysts to resonate with the unconscious of others. This system unconscious is also the wellsprings of spontaneous insights, gestated preconsciously, responding to unconscious communications that take time to register, ripen in a relaxed receptive disposition, and require a relaxed receptive disposition to access. Freud's liberal recommendations for a non-judgmental, evenly suspended listening stance were tailored to provide optimal tuning into, without imposing onto, another's unconscious, detailing how to listen far more specifically than what to listen for. Yet Freud also prescribed analysis of transference and resistance, both to be brushed away as obstacles to the method's principal goal, shibboleths of our method, of what makes a psychotherapy psychoanalytic. However, one cannot be certain that when Reik speaks about tact and timing and reaching to the bottom of psychodynamic truths, that he isn't actually doing the same thing as analyzing transference and resistance. But oh, to have been a fly in the room. What is Reichian is a commitment to upholding a psychoanalysis of the unconscious, for the unconscious, and about the unconscious. His interest was in phenomena at the heart of psychoanalytic data, not in the conceptual, theoretical, or meta-theoretical abstractions derived therefrom, even less in their nomenclature, which he saw as putting a wedge between experience and understanding. His goal, to convey in great depth the phenomenological experience of our specialized listening stance. Through this exercise, he becomes a complement to Freud's sparse comments on technique. So where Freud, the conceptual thinker, delivered a few pointed analogies on how to use this third ear, Reik, as his complement, spells it out in a descriptive tour de force that begins and ends with Freud, the best analyst. That's his quote. The embodiment of psychoanalytic technique for Reik is its non-prejudicial attentional stance. Uneven speech and listening patterns, non-disclosure, and the interpretive agenda were all perfectly fitted by Freud to a situation with a fundamental purpose, gaining maximum access to another's unconscious while maintaining an essential reflective referential linguistic boundary. For Reik, psychoanalytic insight comprised awareness of the analyst's response as part of that psychological moment. This is no different from the classic splitting of the ego into an experiencing and observing stance that must register both incoming as well as upcoming sensory emotive signals. This basic belief fuels Reik's conviction that preconceived theories or expectations obstruct the free-flowing exchange of unconscious meanings, best received with as little interference from the intellect as possible. Reik is concerned with subsensuous phenomena, with sharpening faculties of the analytic nervous system to the panoply of minuscule paralinguistic subliminal signals and signs that qualify the verbal line. The analyzed analyst has already calibrated these functions, and for two factors he states early on, Reik values the authority of the analyst in this situation. First, for extensive psychological knowledge and experience, and second, moral courage, by which he means someone who, having undergone a thorough personal analysis, is able to pursue self-reflection, including the totality of conscious and unconscious emotions. Let me therefore hasten to dispel any notion on the part of the relationists that Reik's stance was a plea advocating current practices. Throughout, interspersed among many segments on the reciprocal flow of unconscious communications, Reik strictly adheres to Freud's prescriptions for A, analytic anonymity, non-disclosure, B, the private introspective use of personal insight for analytic interpretive objectivity, and C, the deliberate tilting of the dialogue by uneven speech patterns for the beneficial, frustrating effects of silence in the situation. These and all other recommendations on how to properly conduct an analysis were arrived at by Freud in order to create optimal conditions in a delicate interpsychical field, not a conscious-based dialogue. In agreement with Frank, Mills, and others sharing this perspective, I reiterate, Freud's practical method and theoretical extrapolations derived therefrom, which feed back to underpin the technique, were operationalized in relational terms by means of theories of early attachment, internalization, identification, and the return of the repressed, through the contextual analysis of transference and resistance. After many modifications, Freud settled on a protocol that maximally enhanced the visibility of the psychical life of the analysand in an interpsychical field of mutual influence, now frequently derailed to levels of conscious interpersonal tete-a-tetes. For those who would appeal to the authoritative field of physics, we learned in the early days of the quantum revolution, Bohr, that an observing instrument and what is observed form part of a whole system, so that what is observed is intrinsically tied to how that instrument is perceiving. It is, in fact, our methodology itself that necessitates the prescribed listening stance in this field. Change any aspect of this system, and you alter the nature of the phenomena of observation. Had our field subjected psychoanalytic methodology to a scrutiny of its features when Rappaport in 1944 recommended it, we would today be speaking of psychoanalytic epistemology, a way of knowing what cannot be accessed by any other means. Unfortunately, these epistemological foundations of psychoanalysis have never been emphasized enough, either with respect to the new depth of its semantic spread or for the broad range of non-linguistic, quasi-biological signal patterns that are identified and interpreted within its discourse situations. Yet it is to this most essentially psychoanalytic terrain of interpretation, the finding of meaning in the unsignified, that the classical stance to which Reik, after Freud, most tenaciously held is fitted. Quotes, "The depth of cognition," he wrote, "is not independent of the way we reach it." The technique of psychoanalysis is operationalized in interactional terms through interpretive activities that simultaneously encompass the self, the other, and the two in relation to each other. The unit of investigation is the single psyche through an interpenetrative dialectic in an interpsychical semantic field generated by two people, germinating and exhibiting the contextual phenomena that are the foundations of psychoanalytic processes and research. Reik understood this and other deeply dialectical qualities of the situation, which led him to touch on emergent processes like telepathy, associative imagery, the reciprocal stimulation of corresponding dynamic patterns, all due to the intense bidirectionality of the psychoanalytic situation. But it is important to keep in mind that for Reik, it is the system unconscious that is predominant, a system of many layers and aspects, especially the dynamically repressed, with its residues of passionate sentiments and unruly drives, its creative linkages redolent with artistic and literary associations, where enigmatic patterns evoke dramatic storylines, universal dynamics meet myth, and Reik's supersensibilities match a current moment to a poem's fragment, fit an amorphous hour to music. With no vocabulary other than fuzzy words like intuition, hunch, conjecture, neurodynamic stimuli, or subsensuous phenomena in a netherworld of subterranean passages, Reik gives the reader a palpable sense of the complex amalgam of stimuli reaching a third ear, a second heart, and a sixth sense, all acting simultaneously on the psychoanalyst's mind. He takes us from the functions of silence to illuminating emotional associations, from the surprise of recognition to the numbness of an inconclusive hour, and finally to a stepwise cognitive process that moves from feelingly thinking through preconscious conjecture to linguistic interpretation, leaving no aspect of the situation unexplored. For this reason, I take the following distinction by one of Reik's most important contributions. He refers to the analytic moment as a response to the unconscious, neither concordant nor counter-transference, or in fact any kind of transference at all, but a distinctly separate and different responsiveness to the other's unconscious communications. To achieve this degree of psychic resonance and distinguish it from the interdynamics of transference, countertransference, the analyst has to be exceptionally sensitive to form, immersed in the dialectic of the other's unconscious messages through empathic attunement. Describing this place from which meanings arise seemingly on their own, Reik burrows deep into the vital soil of his emotions, embodying for us the vitality and disorganizing complexity of the double reflexivity of an experiential code, where the more one knows of oneself, the more one understands of the other. And the work of interpretation entails a constant revisiting in oneself of the dynamic patterns of the other. By 1948, Reik's antipathy for systematizing technique had reached its zenith, and the third year is stripped of all technical jargon to show the phenomenological underbelly of psychoanalytic listening. Although he delves into primary process and describes the observing ego, neither is called by name. No mention is made of defenses, pre-Oedipal or Oedipal libidinal phases, which Reik held suspect, or of resistances or transference as such. And though he interprets his own and a few patients' stream, is interested in the seemingly magical effect of words, he posits no hypothesis for how this comes about. His stance is atheoretical with a vengeance. And so his book abounds in metaphors, poetic allusions, musical analogies, and an arsenal of associations. The language of primary process is Reik's domain. By so divesting his exposition of technical terms, forcing himself into the detailed organic tissue of description, he not only serves the lay reader, but in the best of literary traditions, shows as he tells in the very act of writing. With the same rigor, he shows as he tells of the situation's special features, its lopsidedness, silences and surprises, its peculiar protocol and tactful timing, its attention to detail, and always the slow metabolization of the felt into a kind of understanding that has no name. It is the full-bodied élan of Reik's thinking, his vivid personalizing of his attentional experience, with its flood of self-scrutiny and self-revelation, that give this book its character as it brings him vividly to life. And so we also learn of his pet peeves. Most persistently, we hear of his disdain for the New York psychoanalytic establishment and disaffection for training trends he saw as taking psychoanalysis in the wrong direction, his antipathy for the American news media and for articles in the Quarterly, his intense dislike of Wilhelm Reich and of Brill's shabby translation of Freud. Yet his disparagement for the overemphasis on the clinical application of a method he valued for its interdisciplinary breadth and epistemological potential is not altogether unjustified. Freud many times reiterated, the science of psychoanalysis is not in the material with which it deals, but in the way it works. The importance of reconceptualizing the basic operative principles of psychoanalytic methodology through a semiotically informed analysis of our dialogues, in my opinion, cannot be overemphasized. Articulating our dialogical process in operative terms is the essential scientific step toward unpacking what the metaphors of yore, Issachauer's analyzing instrument, or Reik's third ear alike attempted to capture. Reik's in-depth analysis of the situation, its features, and the internal signifying progression of the analyst's mind were attempts to dissect and document the epistemological processes of psychoanalytic insight through detailed description, the first step in any scientific endeavor. A phenomenon is not a phenomenon until it has been labeled and seen. The problem is our field has continued to move from metaphor to metaphor. The third ear never went beyond the analytic instrument. Somehow, the underlying substance and promise of Reik's work has been underestimated. Yet one cannot be struck by Reik's charismatic enthusiasm, his ability to affect the minds of those who enter his orbit. Like all really good teachers and supervisors, he exemplifies as he models the amalgam of feeling, thinking, linguistic processing, and understanding that his ideas on psychoanalytic listening uphold. One more little segment, I will rush. After the third ear, what's next? In the end, we are left with a crossover work that felt the pulse of a lay readership ripe to know more about psychoanalysts' psyches. Through his experience-near confessional style and effusive expressiveness, Reik at once satisfied a prurient human passion to peer into another's mind while diligently exposing every nuance of the psychoanalytic situation and the analyst's mental activities in it. If, perhaps, his quarrel with and estrangement from mainstream institutions left him outside the community, it enshrined him as a psychoanalyst extraordinaire with the general public. Lecturing in Carnegie Hall, Reik was a huge hit. What then is the true legacy of the third year? I maintain that it would have been to investigate in functional terms the actual semiotic and dialogical processes to which Reik's descriptions refer. He said as much, quotes, "Just as psychoanalysis leads from the intuitive grasp of the unconscious, which poets have always had at their command, to a natural science of the human soul, so it must lead to ranging analytic technique with the rational categories," close quote. In the last pages, Reik appealed to future generations of analysts, gallantly passing the gavel in the hope that his contributions to the complex processes of analytic listening would lead to further scientific progress in our field. For this reason, I, too, invite those who are interested to look into symbolization and forms of knowledge, the former a comprehensive revision of the topographical model, the latter a detailed analysis of the semiotic, pre-semiotic, and dialogical features of phenomena pertaining to the psychoanalytic and supervisory situations. You will find there many of the things Reik wrote about revisited, updated, and revised, broken down into operative and functional processes with new terms allotted to concepts and mental organizations that could only be vaguely alluded to before. Although both meta-theoretical works, they provide a mapping for clinicians for how psychoanalytic dialogues actually work, and for the first time join principles of theory and practice with our general theory of mind. Reik's devotion to Freud rings through the third year from start to finish. Particularly moving is his account of their final farewell in Vienna, both soon to be exiles, as one, toward the end of his days, feeling the distress of the younger one, said, "People don't have to be glued together to belong together." Freud was referring to kinship, not blood kin, which is not chosen, but to kindred spirits, that extraordinary bond of affinity generated by joint passions, professions, endeavors, and beliefs, strong enough to inspire commitment. We who gather here to honor the legacies of Reik's life's work do so precisely in that spirit of collegial kinship that his writings rekindled and inspire in us.
Thank you. Dr. Dany Nobus is the chair of psychology and psychoanalysis, as well as head of School of Social Science at Brunel University in London. He is author of numerous works, including Perversion, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Perspectives on Psychoanalysis, Key Concepts of Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan and the Freudian Practice of Psychoanalysis, and he is writing a book, Theodor Reik, Architect of the Third Year. And also, he is the author of what I consider one of the most interesting articles ever written on Theodor Reik, Fluctuat nec Mercator, I can never say that, or What Happened to Reikian Psychoanalysis, 2006. Dr. Nobus.
Thank you very much.